All right. Well, welcome. In case you haven't been here in a while and you were looking for that middle aisle, it's gone. We've attempted to let it go because it blocks some of the sun from some of your eyes, but we live in a funky place. Like, it's spring here. That means you get a little rain, you get a little sun. And so if the sunlight comes blaring through at you, you can take your sunglasses, or you can just start looking down, and I won't take it as a sign that you're actually not listening to me and that you're totally dialed out. But yeah, it's spring here, and I'm kind of stoked about it. Last week we couldn't get together and worship because there was snow, but now we have moved on. Now we get a little rain, get a little warm weather, and with that comes explosions of color and a new season of life, and I dig it. Our house, when we bought it, it has this big, long stretch of all southwestern exposure, and if you're like a gardener person, that probably means something to you. People told us it was good. And so there's this whole big bed, and we were like, oh, this is going to be amazing. We're going to grow our own veggies, and we'll have berries, and it'll be fantastic. And then all of that stuff comes, just like we planted it, but something else comes with it that we weren't prepared for, and that is simply weeds. We didn't see that coming, and we're not real good at it. And I learned that if you procrastinate about that stuff, it is not a good thing. Weeds are incredibly creative creatures that know how to replicate themselves in cool ways, like little puffy balls of seeds that fly everywhere, and little weeds that when you touch them, they explode and spray things everywhere. And but I can't stand weeding, so we have a nice weed bed on the side of our house. I hate weeding. It was my dad who hated weeding also, who thought it'd be a good punishment for me when I did things wrong in middle school, was to go out and weed. So I learned to hate weeding just like he did. And now we have spring, and we have beautiful color and new life and weeds, all at the same time everywhere. This is kind of a reality, I think, for all of us in all of our lives. The fact is, we get beautiful things in life. We get awesome things in life, but we also get a lot of weeds. I love the Olympics. They're going on. I kind of love all sports, but I love the Olympics. They're going on. The world comes together for this great thing, and it shows kind of the unity that I think we're going to find in heaven one day of all these different cultures and nations and things like that. But at the same time, you get controversies and injuries and protests and all sorts of crazy stuff. And it just reminds me, we get the weeds along with the good stuff. Think of the diversity of music and culture and food. And the diversity that we have is amazing. With that also comes incredible amounts of racism and prejudice and apathy and greed and all sorts of other problems in our world. We have an amazing place to live, blessed by God in incredible ways, but also lots of weeds to go with it. Everything comes with a bit of the weeds. The Hawks just won the Super Bowl. Does it get better than that? Is that not good stuff? But now what? Really? No, we don't have Sonics. We do have the Mariners. Oh, weeds. Not a Mariners fan, sorry. And I think it gets even more personal than that. If we go through our week, think about it. You go through your week, you go to your job, you probably love some part of it, but not all of it. It comes with some weeds. I hang out with a bunch of dads at our men's group on a regular basis, and I hear how much they love their kids, and at the same time, I hear how much those kids absolutely drive them crazy. We live among the weeds. The Bible talks about it as weeds and wheat. I like to think of it as weeds and flowers, but the fact is, all of us are a mix of it, even if we look in our own hearts. We're a mix of these people that are amazing and beautiful and made by God to do amazing and beautiful things in the world. And yet, along with that, there's some weeds going on inside of us. We are not always directed in the right direction, and we have a tendency to leave a mess where we go. And Jesus knew that we were going to be amongst the weeds and the wheat, and he told us a little story that I think gets into this, and it helps provide us some answers to some of the perplexing and troubling things about the weeds and the wheat, and it also, I think, can give us some good wisdom for how to move forward in it. So I'm going to read Matthew 13, 24 through 30, which is a little parable that he told, and then 36 through 43 is where he actually explains the parable. So let me just read it for us, and then we'll dive into it together. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, and the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did all these weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. That's a very dramatic line. "An enemy did this." The servants asked him, "Well, do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." And then he left the crowd and went into the house, and his disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." I love the fact that they need explanations too. It makes me feel a whole lot better when I read stories and I'm like, what on earth is he talking about? And here's how he answered. "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom, and the weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil, and the harvest is at the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. And as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil, and they will throw them into a blazing furnace where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. But then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear." Now, I have to be honest. I have skimmed over this parable countless times, a lot of times, and I had a hard time making sense of it. I kind of just thought Jesus was getting very verbose about explaining, well, there's a heaven and there's a hell, and it's better to go into heaven, and there will be a judgment day, and that's what I thought it was pretty much about, the afterlife. But as I dug more into this parable this week, I realized that it is actually a word of comfort. It's a word of comfort to people who live in a messy world. And it also can give us some ways to move forward in a good way, in a purposeful way, in a way that will bring meaning and blessing to the people around us. So in short, this parable is a word to the wise. Both the wise as in W-I-S-E, but I think it's also a word to the wise as in W-H-Y-S. Like when you're finding yourself wandering through life and saying, why on earth is this happening? And I know that you've probably all been there at some point going, how if there's a God, could this happen? Why? Why? This doesn't make sense. I've been there plenty of times. Why is an important question. A while ago, I was actually having a coffee with a friend of mine. We were planning this event together, and we sat down, and in 5 minutes, he fired through the stuff that we had to get done. And I was like, wow, we got everything done super quick, and now we're still hanging out here. And then he said, hey, you're a pastor, right? At which point I knew I was in trouble. And I start taking slow breaths and praying at those moments. And then he goes, here's a question that I have for you. So you say that God is loving and he knows what's going on and he's powerful and all that good stuff, but why is it that I am stuck with a chronic pain disorder that won't go away? Now, in that moment, I found myself facing his why question, and I found myself in very deep water with not much to say. And I think I fumbled out something about how God loved him, and that wasn't God's intention for him. But to be honest, I didn't have much to share with him. And then I was talking to a pastor friend of mine about this, and I'm like, I just hit the situation, and here's what I said. And he's like, oh, promise me you didn't answer. And I'm like, I did. But here's the deal. Why questions are big questions. And I don't know if not having an answer is enough. I don't know if just being silent. I mean, I know it's a blessing to be with somebody and to care about them. But shouldn't we hear something about the whys in our life? Here's some of the why questions I have faced. Why are there tsunamis and earthquakes and things that go crazy and mess up parts of the world? That stinks. Why is it that if you raise a kid right, he might go off the rails anyway and go in a direction that you were trying so hard for him to not go in? Why is marriage hard? Anybody with me on that one? I don't know. It is. It's hard. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why did I inherit my family's mess? Why is there cancer and death? Why don't people I love and pray for over and over and over turn to Christ? Why are people cruel to each other? Why am I a jerk? Why are there weeds in me, for goodness sake? You have your why questions. I have mine. And they're bigger questions than like, why is a hippo so big? Or why is it that cinnamon rolls taste better than carrots and celery when I'm trying to eat well? But I think we have to hear something about these why questions. And in this parable, God began to unfold something for me, and I want to share it with you. When you see trouble and you see mess and you see the weeds of your life, it's tempting to think that God somehow screwed up making the world, or he set it on autopilot and now it's going to crash, or that there's some gigantic like arm wrestling thing going on between good and evil, and sometimes God seems to be winning and other times he's like getting pressed back. But that is not what this has to say. My friend's theory was that the world just got too big and overpopulated, and that God was like, well, oh well, and he was just like gonna let it like run away and be on like a roller coaster on autopilot, on getting faster and faster until it crashed, which thankfully this parable says something else. And it tells us that the universe is God's field, that he knows what he's doing, and that yes, there's a mess in the world and that we should expect it, but he actually has a reason for allowing the weeds and the wheat to grow together. It tells us that actually God cares so much about people that he has to leave the weeds somewhere, and that were he to go in and do what we suggest to him of, God, why don't you just fix this? It might do some damage that would happen. It's not so easy to rip out the weeds and leave the wheat. Now, I spent a lot of time learning about Middle Eastern farming this week, and that's good because that's my job, but I'm not going to bore you with all the details because that's not your job to be bored with them all. But I will say that what this talked about in this parable was a farmer like going in at night. Guys scattered all this good seed, and a farmer could go in at night and scatter this other seed. And what would happen is they would grow up. And I learned that if you were in the Middle East around Jesus' time and this were to happen to you, the easier thing to do would be to just get out your oxen, you plow the field again, you tear up everything that's there, and you start over. Get some new seed, right? Throw it down. But God doesn't do that. And as much as we are tempted to say, God, why don't you fix this? He's got a better way of handling it. And were he to go about fixing things the way that we intend, it would lead to something like what we see in Genesis 9, I believe it is, Noah's Ark, the flood. Now, if you want, you could read that chapter later, or you could wait a while and you could see the movie of it that's coming out, which I got you a little slide of the movie. There's Russell Crowe as Noah. That is really hard for me to picture, by the way. The gladiator is now the one righteous man around. And Hermione Granger is his daughter. Yeah, that's weird, man. That should not be. Plus, it's a 2-hour movie made out of one chapter of the Bible, so I'd suggest reading the book first to get the real story, and then go see the movie. But here's the thing. Rather than wipe out everything, God cares too much about you and about me and about our world to do that. He doesn't want to harm the crop. He doesn't want to tear up the good with the bad. The servants, his workers, they want things set right just like we do. God says, no, you'll do more damage than good if you go about it that way. Let's do something else. Let's be patient. Let's wait. Let it grow up together. So if you find yourself sitting there and you're asking God, why? Why haven't you fixed this in my life or in the world? I know it sounds a little crazy to say this, but it isn't because God doesn't care. It's because he cares so much. His love for you is so great. His plan for you is so big and it goes so long that were he to just tear it out, to fix things, it wouldn't fix it at all. The parable also tells us that God didn't plant the bad seed. Messed up parts of this world were not what God intended. We started it in paradise and we are headed to paradise, and in between things have gone a mess. And that breaks God's heart just like it breaks ours. God's got a plan, and his plan is bringing about good things, saving people, bringing people back to himself, seeing people made whole. But it doesn't often happen in the way that we want to see it happen. It also tells us that God is a lot more patient than we are. Now, I want things set right now, and I try to be a person who gives like second and third chances to people, but honestly, it doesn't come very natural to me, and I know that I expect a lot of second and third chances, but it's hard for us to give them to each other. We all deserve second chances, but it's a whole lot easier to just give up on people and go, no more. You're out. And when I'm more like a weed than a wheat, I find that in Jesus there's this fresh start again and again and again. That's what grace, that's what mercy does, is it gives us another start. In Matthew 18, there's a story where Jesus' buddy Peter comes up to him and he goes, Jesus, I've been thinking about this whole forgiveness thing that you talk about and this whole grace thing and giving people fresh starts. And how many times should I do this with somebody? I mean, the law says like 3 times, but you're pretty amazing, Jesus. And what if we do it like 7 times? And I'm pretty sure he was expecting Jesus to be like, whoa, 7 times? You're going to forgive someone 7 times? That's amazing. Good job, Pete. You're getting it. Let's do that. And Jesus turns to him and goes, wow, really? How about this? How about instead of 7 times, how about 70 times 7 times? In other words, if you're still keeping track, that's not how God is. There's a fresh start. There's forgiveness and there's grace for our sin and for our brokenness and for our mess and for our weediness. God is gracious and patient and kind. Even when we don't deserve it, his love is there for us. There's one last thing that this reminds us of, and that's that God does have a time frame. That God has not just let it go off the rails, and it's not going to go on forever. God will set things right. All the brokenness that's in us and that is in our world, Jesus has a plan to take care of. When we face difficulties and troubles and we go, why, God? We want to have it stop. He says, hang on. I know what I'm doing. I got you, and I got this. It's a little bit like being on a plane ride. You're on a plane. Let's say we're going somewhere awesome. My wife has been saying it'd be really cool to go to Hawaii. I have a tendency to agree with her. That would be a nice little trip. So let's say we're on a plane to Hawaii for now, because that's about as close as I'm going to get to it for a while, is imagining it. So I'll imagine it with you all. We're all on a plane. And you're up in the air, and then there's this turbulence, right? And the plane starts shaking, and drinks are falling over, and stewardesses are rushing back to their seats. Somebody left the overhead bin open, and so everything is flying out. And you sit there and you go, why? Did the captain, fall asleep at the wheel? What if I just wish I was on the ground again. And were the captain to actually take the plane down right at that moment and put you down on the ground again, you would be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Not good. So hang in there. It's a little bumpy. It's a little messy. Life isn't always easy. But if you hang on, you keep going, you're going to land in paradise. That's a little bit how it is with the gospel. Or imagine this, city improvement project going on in your neighborhood. You're stoked. The sidewalks are all beat up. There's giant cracks. Some old lady hurt their ankle there the other day, and that's why they started to do this whole thing. And they're going to put in a whole new community center, and it's going to be amazing. Housing values are going to skyrocket. You're going to live in this lovely neighborhood, and you're like, yes, finally. And then 7 a.m. comes, the day that they start the project. And there's a jackhammer right outside your window, breaking up all that bad pavement. And dust begins to settle over everything that you own. And pretty soon you're like, why is the city doing this to me? But if you hang on, if you let the weeds and the wheat be there, if you can just keep on following, it's going to be a pretty cool neighborhood one day. So when you find yourself asking why, you find yourself wondering, does God care or does he even know what's going on? I think what God would say is, trust me. We can do this. I got this. Stick with me. I'll take you to good places. It's okay that there's weeds and wheat at the same place right now. So I think that's part of what I found about the whys. Let's turn to the other whys, the W-I-S-E. What's a person like you and me to do? How could this impact what we do this week or how we live? First things first, I think we have to figure out where we are in the story. Let me read for you the reaction to weeds popping up among the servants again. Verses 27 through 30. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" I got to admit, that's my first reaction when things go wrong, is to go, God, what are you doing? I think you might have screwed up. Here's how I would have it done. And the servants say, well, okay, do you want us to go pull them up? He says, no, because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let them both grow together. It's tempting for us to put on our gardener hat and to start correcting how God's doing things and what's going on, and to say, oh, okay, well, let me fix that. It's tempting to hop into that servant role. Say, God, you messed up, and I can fix this. And that's my tendency, you know. Maybe you've had this experience. My wife comes home from a long day at work, and she begins to share some of the stuff that's going on, and it's stressful, and she's like, this person's doing this, and there's this situation at work. I don't know if you're like me, but you sit there and you go, okay. And then you go, well, why don't you do this? As if somehow all of those people in that place, I know absolutely nothing about her situation at this point. All of those people in that place have not been able to figure out the brilliance that I had sitting on my couch as she shared this one story with me. And I go to fix it. And she's like, that's not really helpful. Why don't you just do this? And I realize, as I sit here and I process this, how silly it is for me to go to God and say, God, why don't you just do this? I mean, it's fine, it's honest, it's good conversation, but I don't think it's actually helping God sort it out. And I picture these servants in God's name like grabbing their shovels and their weed pullers and going, here, we'll go get it, boss, we got this. And they rush off and they start tearing out things that they think look like weeds. The only problem is, in the story, it says that they're not very good at figuring out which is which. They'll tear out the wheat with the weeds. In the story that Jesus told, some of the translations talk about weeds and wheat. Other ones say the wheat and the tares. I didn't know what a tare was, so I had to go dig around and figure out what that word was. And the word in Greek is actually zizania, which I'm only sharing with you because it's fun to say. So say it with me, zizania. Yeah, it's cool, huh? So zizania, weeds, they come up just like wheat does. And it looks just like wheat. Except at the end, when it's finally full grown and it produces something, what it produces instead of wheat germ and kernel is black poisonous seeds. It looks just exactly the same growing up, though. Now, what that means is that the weeds and the wheat are pretty darn similar. They're just like us. They are us, honestly, sometimes. They get out of bed, they get up, they get their coffee, they go to work. They hang out in the same place. And as we go through, what are the chances, if we're a mix of this weeds and wheat stuff, that we're going to be good at figuring out who are the other people that are weeds and wheat? To be honest, a lot of my life is pretty zizania-y, weedy. It's well-meaning. But because I haven't followed God, because I haven't let God filter what I'm doing, where He's leading me, I think sometimes I can leave some pretty nasty, poisonous messes around. When we come across difficult people, when we have a tendency to put our categories around what is good, what's bad, which people should be doing and shouldn't be doing, I think it has a tendency to get messy. We have a tendency to pull out wheat when we should be pulling out weeds. Reminds me a little bit of a story that my mom loves to share with strangers, much to my embarrassment, about me. When I was 3 or 4, she loves gardening, by the way, and she decided that she needed to go out and do some gardening, and she would just bring me along and have me help. And she took me out to her garden, which had all these gorgeous flowers, and began to do some weeding. And she showed me how to do it, here's a weed, and here's what you don't touch. And then she would leave big Herkin weeds there so I wouldn't miss them, and leave them for me to pick up. And I started to pull on them, but they're kind of hard to rip out. And so I figured out that the flowers were a whole lot easier to tear out. And so I just followed her and tore out all the flowers. And the good news of that is I was not asked to weed again for many years, which is probably a blessing. But I think it's real easy for us to do that as Christians, as people who start to get a sense of right and wrong in our life and who start to figure out maybe what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. And we have a tendency to get into a weeding mode and to think that we're the servants and it's our job to go and weed everybody else's life as well. I get concerned when we, as Christians, start rallying against something, a perspective or an issue. It's not that there's not right and wrong, But I know that at the other end of that issue is a group of people who God loves just as much as he loves us, and who are just as much beautiful and just as much a mess as we are. I worry when Christians tell me about the people they don't like, and I worry when I see myself categorizing people by all sorts of stupid things. Economic background, faith, story, whatever. Because I'm starting to decide who's wheat, who's weeds. I'm not very good at that. The most harm that I have seen done in the history of this whole Jesus thing has been done often by Christians who, very well-meaningly, trying to follow God, somehow snuffed out God's love in a place because they were weeding. The worst black eyes of Christians. When we start to judge things, I think we start falling into what Adam and Eve fell into. They thought by eating this fruit they could be right and wrong, but they never quite got it right. When we push our agendas or our issues or our morals, it rarely produces good fruit. Just think of the stories, man. Like the Puritans. We'll go way back. Puritans. They burned witches to keep purity in their community. Now that's horrible. We would all go, why on earth would you burn somebody in Jesus' name? That's horrible. Or like the Spanish Inquisition. I know we'll torture people because they don't have our dogma quite right. It's pretty messed up. Or the Pharisees, we got to get everything just right for God, and there's this guy Jesus really messing things up, so we got to make sure to kill him off first. Okay, we can see these things and we go, man, that is a mess. Maybe more recently, like, okay, we're going to go yell hate messages at a bunch of scared teenagers and doctors over abortion issues. I was sitting there at my mom's wedding ceremony. She's gay, and we were sitting there, and I was talking to a lady whose dad was a pastor and had disowned her for 30 years because she was in love with another one. Now, whatever perspective you have on these issues, I guarantee you she was not real open to the idea that there was a God who loved her and that person could be found in Jesus Christ. Something got snuffed out because something else got put more important in it. It was weeding. It was making things clear. We aren't the judge at all. We're not gardeners. When I was 19, I was a mess. I was a suicidal druggie. And a bunch of my friends kind of go, that guy is a lost cause. He's a weed. Just stay away from him. And rightly so. I was a mess. And I brought a mess with me. But I had this one friend who kept inviting me. They were just a solid friend. They said, why don't you keep hanging out? Keep coming. You don't always have to be a weed. There's some weed over here that you could come join us and you could maybe try on being weedy. She'd invite me to church retreats, which was the last thing on my mind that I wanted to go to. And eventually I did. I showed up at her church, and I showed up in torn sweatpants and an Alice in Chains t-shirt. And this was a very traditional church with suits and ties and things. And at that church, I met a bunch of people who just welcomed me in. They go, whatever. We're all just weeds and wheat. Come on in. Come hang out with us. You want to come to our house and have lunch? That'd be awesome. I'm like, really? Me? But here's the deal. They decided they weren't gardeners. They knew their role. They were wheat. They were to spread among the field. And to maybe, if they were lucky, see some weeds change into wheat. And somehow, by the power of God and by the patience that they had with me, I began to catch a glimpse of a God who loves me and is patient with me and would welcome me in as well. And it changed my life, absolutely transformed it. We're not the gardeners, my friends. It's not who we are. We're wheat, there to spread among the garden. God's work in the field. He knows what he's doing. So who do you find yourself against? It's so easy for us to define us by who we're against. Who is the us and who is the them? Who is your them? Who's the lost cause? Who's that person that you can't seem to forgive? Who's that person you can't welcome into your life? Who's that person about at work that the conversation starts and you know it's going to be a negative one? What do? Do you join in? Define it? Same as weed? Or do you go, no, we're all wheat? Speak up. We aren't called to do weeding. We're called to let God do it. And he does beautiful, good things, and he changes what we would have thought would be weeds into wheat all the time. So how do we move forward? What do we do? Here's my thought. Let's stay in good soil. Let's stay connected to a gardener who actually knows what he's doing. Preen our life maybe a little bit with some worship and some prayer and some scripture, and try to take care of ourselves and the people around us. Maybe we should just love people and serve people like Jesus did as much as possible. Let him sort it all out at the end. Let's just do our best to bring a smile to God's face and to love him and to love the people around us, especially those people that we think are weeds. Let's be wheat, not gardeners. Let's be people who spread the goodness of God and the love of God. Let's quit worrying about what we're against and get down to the business of what we're for Jesus and for people around us. That's pretty simple. Let's let God be God and trust him and hang in there when we want to ask why.